Hello, I'm Yang-May Ooi. I'm a cross-cultural advocate and author. I describe myself as Chinese by heritage, Malaysian by birth, and British by choice. So I grew up in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, but I left when I was 12 to come over to the UK to school and uni. And then I stayed on to follow a career as a lawyer. I also have a parallel life as a writer and podcaster. Welcome to Belonging Across Cultures, my new podcast and multimedia project exploring themes of belonging, difference, and connection. Now, for this first episode, I spoke with Amir Muhammed, who, like me, was born and grew up in Kuala Lumpur, or KL, as Malaysians call it. But unlike me, he stayed on to build his creative life in Malaysia. Amir is the founder of Fixi Books, an independent publisher of contemporary urban fiction based in KL. He also produces indie films at Kuman Pictures. His books and films are written and produced by Malaysians for Malaysians. We had a wide-ranging conversation about contemporary Malaysia, and he shared his frank views on the contradictions of belonging in Malaysian society. So, let's get on with the show. Amir Muhammed, how
Hello.
long have you lived in KL and what do you love about the city?
I've lived in KL most of my life. I was born in 1972 and I left the country for the first time in 1990. For the first 18 years of my life, this is the only city I knew, except for occasional visits to Singapore, which I think any Malaysian treats Singapore as like a bigger and more organized and cleaner and more efficient place, but less interesting for whatever reason.
And we Malaysians, we have a bit of a rivalry with Singapore. I think Singaporeans think that Malaysia, KL, is very chaotic and disorganized. And as you said, we think Singapore is super efficient.
I did stay once in Singapore for quite a long period, for a few months, working on a film script that thankfully never got made because it was not very good. And I remember the precise moment where I realized that I'm not Singaporean, I'm Malaysian, because it was about after midnight and I was going back to the flat in Tampines, which is sort of outside city center. And the lights were green, but it was after midnight. There were no cars at all, zero. But I still didn't cross the road. I just sort of stood there by the side thinking that I have to be a good citizen. I cannot break this law. So that's when I realized that, I've been away from Malaysia for too long because no Malaysian would do that.
Yeah, we're much more sort of free and easy. And where did you go for your studies abroad?
I went to the University of East Anglia. It's a very flat place, but I enjoyed it. I wanted to get out of Malaysia to study. I suppose the biggest difference would be as I was growing up entirely in KL and a bit in Singapore, just how multicultural KL is. And this is something I probably took for granted. I kind of assume a lot of other cities were like that. And then when I moved to Norwich, boy, was it a surprise, like everyone spoke English. Whereas in KL, you can walk down many streets and hear many languages. You will definitely hear Malay. You would hear English, Tamil, and various types of Chinese. Hokkien and Cantonese would be predominant. Now you will hear more Mandarin. Now you will hear Nepali. You will hear Bangladeshi, and Myanmarese, and Indonesian, which is, similar to Malay, but anybody can tell the difference if you're from here.
And in terms of the type of city, perhaps you could just describe a little bit about KL, Kuala Lumpur.
I was quite lucky in the sense that my growing up years were kind of in the center of the city because both my primary school and my secondary school were kind of smack in what you would consider city center. I was used to walking, after school, to go to a bus or to go to a movie. They were still standalone cinemas then. They are no longer around. And some of my schoolmates would go to like snooker parlors and all that, but it wasn't really my scene. But I would buy pirated VHS tapes, which is interesting because Malaysian film, the Malaysian cinema circuit has one of the worst censorship policies in the world. A lot of films until now still get censored and banned and so on. But people don't really complain because you could buy the uncut version from a friendly yellow-haired Chinese guy who would shout at you if you didn't buy anything, So because it's like bad luck if you browse and don't buy. So this idea that there are bad laws to do with censorship, but we can get away with it by I think it gives us a certain ambiguous relationship with authority. I mean, we were lucky that we were never under this kind of brutal dictatorship which you saw in other countries in the region. I mean, we never had a Pol Pot or a Indonesian genocide in 1965, and the Marcos years. And these are countries which are very close to us, and so we always felt that Malaysia is very lucky in the sense that we've had a very kind of benevolent authoritarianism. I think that's the phrase that political scientists use, which means that even when we had street protests, which were quite unprecedented in the late 90s, they sort of ended early. So it's the opposite of our shops because it ended by 6 and then everybody would just go out to eat and the police would be in one table and the protesters would be in the next table. And I think foreign journalists found that very odd. It's like, everybody is just, it's like a pretend protest. But I think that's just the way we do it. We don't go to extremes in one way. So, and I think this is something I have been thinking about as well. Like, there's nothing extreme about KL. It's not extremely crowded. It's not extremely modern. It's not extremely backward. We are kind of in the middle of everything. The only thing where we are extreme in is this absurd desire to build the tallest skyscrapers, which really stands out because it's really out of character for the city. So it's kind of ironic that I think if you haven't been to KL, you would probably know what the Twin Towers look like. But the rest of the city does not look like that. But now there are other towers trying to get even taller. So that's the one area where I think we are sort of off balance. Everything else, I think people keep a certain equilibrium. So my controversial thesis is mediocrity is fine. We should embrace it. Because at least, we never went out as a nation and tried to conquer another nation. We never, unlike many other Asian countries we could mention. So I think that's fine. We will never reach maybe those heights of excellence, winning Nobel Prize or whatever, but we never go the other way as well. We never become these genocidal freaks. So I'm quite content with our mediocrity. Speaking for myself.
Yes. So interesting that you touch on this thing about the tallest building. The Petronas Towers, the Twin Towers, were built around the 1990s. And at that point, I was wanting to be a writer, and I conceived of the idea for my first novel, The Flame Tree, which was around the idea of building the tallest building in Asia in the Titiwangsa Mountains. And this was going to be the highest university, with the tallest thing. A little bit satirical about the Malaysian idea of building the tallest building. And of course, subsequently, after the Twin Towers was built, I think Shanghai managed to get a bigger, taller tower by putting a mast on top, which I just felt, cheating lah, putting a mast on top. It's not the tall building, it's a building with a mast on top.
Then Taipei, Dubai, all these, it was very insecure.
So what do you love about KL, Kuala Lumpur, the city?
I like being in the older part of the city where you can still see the architecture from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Of course, people know about this Anglo-British, what am I saying? Anglo-Indian kind of structures like the old railway station, which is now kind of mostly abandoned, and the old courthouse building, which is also mostly abandoned. We have a lot of, unfortunately, we tend to neglect our heritage sites. The older cinema, which just recently on social media, it was announced, Coliseum Cinema, it's up for sale if anybody wants to buy it because it closed down after 100 years. So, and the shop houses, the Chinese shop houses around places like Petaling Street, Jalan Sultan, and then the main shopping road, which used to be called Batu Road, Now it's named after the first king, Tuanku Abdul Rahman. And because things are kind of close to you, you don't feel like you need to look up everything. It's very ground level. So that's what I like. And maybe it's a trick of memory, but probably due to global warming. I used to think that it's a pleasant place to walk around in. But yeah, I think the weather's gotten hotter and hotter. And also, cars have become more prominent or predominant in the intervening decades because now it's easy, it's cheap to own a car. It's a city that is increasingly tailored to cars rather than people. So that gives it a certain hostility. There are not that many public spaces aside from shopping malls. So shopping malls become a kind of haven. Everybody has a favorite shopping mall. Everybody identifies with their favorite shopping mall, which is kind of strange, but we take it quite personally if somebody doesn't like our shopping mall, which is like the weirdest thing. They're cool places, like temperature-wise, they're cool. But of course, it's no substitute from having real places where different people can meet. There used to be a nice place under Dataran Merdeka, under the square, sort of Independence Square, which had a theater, which had performers and all that, and people could mix around and make quite interesting connections in a very casual way. But that was damaged in a catastrophic flood. And that sense has not been replicated. Yeah, so it's become, spaces are very commercialized now, very commodified. So that's one of the things I envy if I looked at other countries. And, there are places in public where you can just hang out and meet people without the pressure to buy things.
Yeah, there's quite a lot in what you said that I want to pick up on. So I think firstly, a point you made a little bit earlier on, which is around the dilapidation of the colonial heritage, the law courts and the railway station. Do you think that colonial countries like Malaysia should preserve the heritage of the colonial age, or do you think it's right to actually let it go? Or is there somewhere in between where you preserve it, but you comment on the colonialism and actually how we've moved on?
Yeah, I think it's of course obviously very politically fraught, but I think on the basic aesthetic level, it kind of is part of the landscape. These are some of the buildings are just very unique in the sense architecturally, like you don't find in other places. It's not like they transplanted wholesale designs because they were influenced from India, from Persia, and from China, for example. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you could do what Singapore does, which is to maintain the facade, make it quite pretty, but inside it's totally different. It's totally modern. So heritage becomes a kind of a tourist attraction. So it's there to sell. But you have some bizarre things as well, like they would, commemorate Stamford Raffles' so-called founding of Singapore. But that was actually, the start of English colonialism in that island. So, which is kind of weird. You mark that as the birth of your national identity, when surely your national identity started before that. But of course, priorities are always with what is new and what the developers will make the most money from. So I don't think we're anti-colonial. We're just pro-developer.
And so moving on to the change of the landscape of Kuala Lumpur from really an old walkable city. And of course, most cities all around the world were walkable before the motor car. And now when I go back, I find it quite overwhelming because of all the freeways and highways that are right in the middle of the city. So here in the UK, I'm used to having London, which is relatively walkable, but actually in KL, the highways and motorways seem to start in the middle of the city. And my parents' house was it's now called the Lake Titiwangsa Park. It's in that area. And we used to be able to just walk out and actually go for little walks along the road. And now if you come out onto what I remember as Jalan Pahang, it's just this kind of multi-spaghetti junction highway.
That is definitely a bad thing. And it was a very 1980s, 90s Mahathir era kind of policy, which who wanted industrialization. It brings in a lot of investment from overseas. So cars became very cheap to own. And we even had, a national car thing, which was a source of great pride in the 90s. No rich person in KL takes public transport. And I'm not rich, but I've recently started taking public transport more seriously. It gets me more connected again to the idea of just looking around. Of course, most people are just looking at their phones, but looking around and noticing how the landscape has changed and the landscape of the people, the mix of people have changed. I mean, some people can look at it with a kind of alarm, like, oh, suddenly so many non-Malaysians around. And and there can be some xenophobia when it's noticed that, oh, if you ride public transport, you will see a lot of migrant workers. That's just a sign that they are here to do work that no one else, no local wants to do. And yes, we do have a human trafficking problem as well. But it also means that the city is changing. So the city should change because we ourselves change.
So Malaysia was considered, when I was younger in the 60s and 70s, not yet a developed country by the UN standards. And now economically, it's done really, really well it was an agricultural economy, moved to an industrial economy, and now it's more sort of industrial financial services, that sort of thing. And with the incoming of factories and inward investment, you had people got better wages, better standard of living. And part of these infrastructures that you touched on earlier was contributed to the fact that people now can have a really good lifestyle and everybody can afford a car. There are policies in place to allow people to afford a car because it's, as you said, cheap to buy a car. And so, who am I to make any criticism about the fact that these Malaysians have a fantastic lifestyle? I suppose then that the problem is also around the fact that you can have roads. And I remember as a child, and as a young person going to school and being stuck in traffic, and my dad being late for work or coming home and he'd be hours stuck in traffic. And this was back in the days when we didn't have the highways. And so, okay, let's build some highways and put some more arteries and arterial whatever. But what you're saying now is all that has just added to more cars, more traffic, more time sitting in traffic jams. So that's a little depressing. I just wish there was a way that cities can manage infrastructure, traffic, and also allowing people, a good standard of living and a good lifestyle without, you give with one hand and then you take away with the other.
But then again, the first time I went to Jakarta, boy, was that a traffic jam. So, sometimes we comfort ourselves by just comparing to something that's worse. And Jakarta is a great city, fabulous city, but boy, the traffic jams are worse than KL. And so is Manila. Manila is worse. Yeah. So, but in general, I think many countries, and we are not an exception, are far too centralized in the way too many jobs, too many industries are concentrated in only the big cities. So that has had an effect that a lot of towns, not even particularly small towns, just sort of medium-sized towns, you don't really find young people working there. You would find like only older people or the very, very young school-going thing. So that's kind of a shame that people feel the need to come here to earn a living. So it should ideally be less centralized. But of course, it's a big macroeconomic kind of problem.
So what about the landscape of Malaysia? Of course, Malaysia is on the equator. It's a tropical climate, 30 degrees most of the time. There's wet season, dry season. But can you describe a little bit the landscape of Malaysia and what do you love about that?
A lot of it is palm oil trees. If you're driving up and down the highway, you would kind of see that. You would still see lots of paddy fields. Well, it's very green. There are mountains, some of which are being made bald for development. And we used to say that there would be an extra season in the year where it was called the haze. The haze is a euphemism for this huge pollution that would envelop most of the peninsula, at least on the west coast, because of forests that are being burned, like oil palm trees that are being burned, because it's cheaper to do that than to clear it. So for a few weeks, you would have haze.
I just wanted to chip in here about the haze. I'm quite surprised that it's still going on because I wrote my second legal thriller, Mind Game, in about the 2000s. At that point, the haze was terrible. It was forest fires from, I think, Indonesia drifting across Asia. And just to describe for our listeners who are not from the region, it's like thick, thick, thick fog, and the smell is horrible. It's smoke, and it
Yes,
causes a lot of respiratory problems for people, and it's just absolutely horrible. And I use the haze as a sort of metaphor in my book for the kind of moral corruption and whatever. So it's rather sad that it still seems to be still going.
It's not as terrible as it used to be. Yeah, but once in a while you still see them. Yeah.
And so, what is it that you love about the landscape of Malaysia outside of KL?
So lately, I've been traveling a lot to the East Coast, where I find it's charming in an entirely different way. The people are actually very chill, very laid back, and I just like the kind of market atmosphere where you can go to a market in the morning and find all kinds of things. It's not such a shopping mall centered kind of culture as it is on the West Coast. And last year, for fun, I decided to take a 3-week bus trip in Sarawak, which is a state I'd never spent that much time in. It is the largest state. And the highway is very developed now. I chose to go to also some of the smaller kind of towns. And that was just very refreshing to me because I got used to a certain rhythm there that every morning go to the nearest place and have mee kolo for breakfast. And I used to buy these chili bulbs, which are very spicy and which I later found out is like the Sarawakian version of habaneros, which you only get in Sarawak, apparently. It's not really grown on the peninsulas. So, but Sarawak is different from the rest of Malaysia because it's the only state with a Christian majority. So it was just very interesting to go to some, small towns. And for the first time ever in Malaysia, I would notice, this town has no mosque. It's a nice perspective to see that you take for granted.
So for our listeners, just to describe some of the context geographically, there's West Malaysia and there's East Malaysia. West Malaysia is a peninsula. It starts when Thailand ends and it goes all the way down and then it hits Singapore. And the West Coast is historically more urban and more cosmopolitan, I suppose, because it is it kind of fronts the Straits of Malacca, which was the main trading route. So you have Malacca, which was historically a very, very important port city, but now has declined, and Kuala Lumpur, and then Singapore, and the ships would kind of round the sort of end of Singapore and head into Hong Kong and China. And that's also where spices came through from Indonesia. The East Coast is facing the South China Sea, and it's more rural, more agricultural. And East Malaysia is made up of Sabah and Sarawak, and it's on the big island of Borneo. So now you are the founder of Fixi Books, a leading book publisher in Malaysia. How do your authors portray KL, the city, and Malaysia?
One of the first projects we did for our English language label, which is called Fixi Novo, we started an anthology series called KL Noir. And KL Noir had 4 books, each named after a color of the Malaysian flag. So we had red, white, blue, and yellow. And we published them in like 2014, and they sold quite well by Malaysian standards. I mean, they each sold between 10,000 to 20,000, which is actually considered quite good for books in English. What I found was that people like to show that KL is a corrupt place filled with corrupt people, with violent people, but good always shines through. Where a bad person gets what they deserve. So it had a certain morality to it as well. If people take the biggest city in their place, so that city becomes the repository of, everything that is negative and cynical about the country. Whereas it may not necessarily be the case because, objectively speaking, KL is not even that big a city when you compare to others in the region like Jakarta and Bangkok and Manila. The scale is much bigger. Then actually KL seems like such a small and cozy and safe place, relatively.
In terms of your other language publications, What would be the other languages? Malay?
Malay is our main language. Yeah, we have stories from pretty much all the states. In fact, one of the better ones I've read that we've published is set entirely in Terengganu, and it's about a midwife in a government clinic who travels back in time, like 100 years ago, and finds herself in the middle of a kind of a anti-British sort of movement, which happened in Terengganu back then. But also there's supernatural elements because she encounters these Lang Sui and Penanggal. So these are like traditional spirits, like ghouls, right? And who are, trying to steal babies and so on. And it's just very entertaining because she's a very motivated heroine. She uses her medical knowledge to her advantage. And then there's a traitor amongst their midst. And it's about, the history of the place. And she made sure to set it in a few actual villages, the 100 years ago. But all these villages have since been submerged under the Kanye Dam. So it's just quite interesting that this young writer wanted to research. And the names of those kampongs are fantastic. They're named after fruit. They're named after sort of natural phenomena. They're named after mystical kind of things as well. Our best-selling novel is actually set in Sabah, and it's written by a Sabahan writer, and it's a horror story in a girls' dormitory. So there are a few sort of supernatural beliefs that are sort of unique to Sabah that become part of the story. So a lot of those books that are set in different states will try and highlight certain things that are special to the state. Yeah, our best-selling books tend to have, supernatural elements. They tend to be horror or thriller. The dominant genre for Malay novels, aside from us, would be romance, but we chose not to publish romance because it's such a crowded field. But having said that, sometimes when we do publish romance, they tend to sell very well.
So when I was growing up in Malaysia, we had stories of the supernatural, Pontianak and horror stories that we as children would just scare ourselves silly. We want to hear about it, but we were so terrified. Do you think that this strand of the supernatural and horror is a very sort of Malaysian interest because somehow the landscape or the history of Malaysia and is very connected with local folklore and these kinds of tropes?
It might be a Southeast Asian thing because I think in Java and in Thailand and in Philippines, you have similar kind of stories. It comes from our experience of growing up in certain environments where, it is dangerous to go out at night because some wild beast would kill you. So even when those wild beasts are no longer there, people hold on to these as ways to explain certain phenomena. And of course, you can have a field day talking about, why they tend to be female. So, why is this fear of the female there? And what this represents. Because these are all, every horror story is kind of at heart a cautionary story, like saying don't go there or don't do this. So why is there this need to always scare children in particular to be so scared of doing things? It's a kind of control. But I think it comes from the landscape. If you're in the middle of a thunderstorm, you do hear, very frightening things. And in the middle of the night, you do hear, if you live in the countryside, you do hear all kinds of things that, you probably don't want to think too much about what those things are.
You are also the founder of Kuman Pictures, a film production company making Malaysian new wave cinema.
We did one Tamil horror movie that was set in Penang Hill. So that was quite location specific. That was also about the idea of Tamil labor, which was responsible for building a lot of the West Coast, including Penang Hill. So that this funicular, you call it, right? This railway up Penang Hill could be finished on time. And of course, there's a price to pay. Like every few years, it'll come to take its sacrifice.
And it also seems that from what you've described, you're tackling social issues, migrants and Tamil workers from the past.
I think it always comes from the script. We have these script competitions, and I think we're now having our third one. So we tend to pick things that are refreshing, I guess. Like the most recent movie we finished, it's called Sabong. It's set in Sabah, and it's about cockfighting, which is actually a practice among some people in Sabah. We're doing a fictionalized version of that. It's written by two Sabahan scriptwriters. So it's not the idea that we see the social issue first, but we see the story, and if there's something unique to it, then usually that means inevitably there will be some kind of social context, because where does this uniqueness come from? I mean, I always say that Malaysian cinema is the most exciting in the world because there are so many films we have not yet made. So it's a very wide open field, actually, compared to other countries. So it's a great time to start making movies and to start writing books, because like movies, there are so many books that have not yet been written. And I always think when people talk about KL, how is it different through the decades? Unfortunately, a lot of the reactions, if you see on social media, would tend to be quite xenophobic, because a lot of Malaysians are saying that it's being overrun by foreigners. And of course, what they mean is, low paid migrant workers. You get a lot of these very xenophobic things, especially every year during our annual holidays. The two biggest ones are Hari Raya, which internationally you call Idul Fitri, and Chinese New Year, right? These are the two times when traditionally it seemed as if most of the city would go away. But maybe starting 10 years ago, that's no longer the case. Many people still stay back in the city because maybe they grew up here. They have no other hometown to go to. And we have so many migrant workers who that is their only holiday, because we don't have good labor protections, that sometimes they only have literally 1 or 2 days off in the entire year. So they go out. They go out to shopping malls that they happen to have built. So literally, they're their own labor with their own hands, sometimes paid for with their lives. And you will get so many negative comments like, this is mini Dhaka. And these are people who's, 2 or 3 generations ago, where were your ancestors from? Are you so sure they're from, a middle class background like you are now? So I think actually the best upcoming Malaysian books and Malaysian movies would come from precisely these people, these migrant workers now, that would probably shock us, because we Malaysians were quite spoiled, and we tend to squabble about very petty things. We're also I think middle class Malaysians are very entitled. Many people are very used to having, domestic help. So if my great hope is that, within my lifetime, and we will be able to see this kind of work coming from the migrant workers, because they will see us for what we really are, and without trying to sugarcoat anything. So I think that's exciting in a way. We've not seen that yet.
I think that is so true about Malaysians and the generations, and we forget, because we in this third or fourth generation have comfortable middle-class lives. My ancestors came to Malaya, as it used to be, from China. My great-great-grandfather was an indentured labourer, and he worked off his indenture, was able to own some land, farmed. His son, my great-grandfather, became a hospital orderly. His son, the next generation on, was my grandfather. He became a doctor. He was at that point where it was coming up to the independence of Malaysia. My father was the first generation of young people after independence. So the opportunities were fantastic. And so now here I am. I'm in the UK. I speak British like the British. I also can speak Malaysian now, because that's where I'm from. And I'm an international person. And I feel very grateful, because some people might say, oh, you're just this really privileged toff, this posh woman. Yes, I'm very lucky, but I'm very privileged. But what I have was built by generations of people who worked hard. And exactly as you say, the migrant workers who are in Malaysia now are the equivalent of those people, our ancestors. And I think it's great to be reminded, let's just take a breath and be grateful. And the reason all these quote unquote horrible migrant workers are swarming around Malaysia is because Malaysia now is a developed country by the standard, whichever the World Bank standards. It's where you're developed and there's a good economic standard of living, and is educated, many people, and they don't want to do the jobs that the migrant workers are doing. Actually, it's in a strange sort of way, it's a good thing to have all these migrant workers, but it's quite a difficult and nuanced conversation to have, which is difficult to have on Twitter. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of your films, Pendatang, which won accolades, I believe, at film festivals. And because it touches on this very sensitive, prickly area of race relations in Malaysia.
Yeah, because to quote a line from a comedy show in the 90s, Malaysia is a multi-racist country. So I think everybody who grows up here will realize that we are an incredibly race-conscious country. I mean, you have to fill up your race in every single form, including if you want to run a marathon, it's like, oh, what race are you? And I think people who grow up entirely here kind of assume that's kind of the norm, which of course it shouldn't be, right? And it's a legacy of our political history, which is about the way we gained independence by saying that our three major ethnic groups in the peninsula would each have their own political party. And that's the kind of system that prevailed for decades, for 60 years. And even though ostensibly that coalition has collapsed, we still have that logic still being perpetrated. Like each politician, in order to rise up, will have to become like the champion of their own race, and of course that always means, by highlighting how you are better, but at the same time marginalized against. And we've seen that our civil service has become, very Malay-centric, Malay being the dominant ethnic group, which I think, foreigners tend to think Malay and Malaysian are kind of synonymous, but any Malaysian can tell you that, they are quite big repercussions, for being Malaysian and not Malay, and Malay and other kind of thing, or rather between being Malaysian and being Malay. So there's a kind of a split there. So I recently published this book. No, I didn't write it, called The End of the 1990s by a young economist, who posited that the 1990s were probably the best time to create this thing called a Malaysian race, because there was so much money in that decade that people became less paranoid of each other and less fearful. But of course, once the economy collapsed by the end of the 90s, we kind of regressed to this very tribal kind of mentalities. So that was very interesting the way he put it. So Pendatang is in that context of race consciousness. The scriptwriter was inspired by an incident a few years ago where there were almost racial riots, but it wasn't like a full-blown riot. It just lasted for a few hours, where it started from a young Malay man being accused of stealing a handphone or something like that in Lawyat Plaza in Bukit Bintang, which is sort of dominated by Chinese businesses, ethnic Chinese businesses. So it almost became this full-blown racial incident because, of course, it was fanned by these very Malay right-wing kind of political actors. So, and the scriptwriter was following that in real time, on social media, I suppose, and thought that, how could something so small trigger this big thing? So that was the basis of Pendatang, where the word itself is a kind of a loaded word. Pendatang can mean just immigrant or outsider, but it's often used in a sort of derogatory way about anybody who is not Malay Muslim. So saying that you are, by saying that these people are not fully integrated with the dominant race and therefore should be viewed with suspicion. So Pendatang is a dystopian scenario which envisions that the whole country took think, referendum where it's something like Brexit, right? Where it's like, okay, should we all be separated by law? Like you cannot mix. And a big part of the population, I can't remember how many percent, something like 76% or 79% voted, yes, we should do it. So it is in that scenario, is in that backdrop. Of course, being dystopian, you have to look at the negative side of things. So, but the scriptwriter chose to inverse the traditional relationship by having a Malay girl stuck in a Chinese house. So in other words, she was the pendatang. She was the outsider, or she was the immigrant. And that kind of took some people by surprise. And some people said, oh, that means we're not really addressing the real racism in Malaysia, because to some people, only Malays are racist, right? So I think it was an audacious premise, and we did it entirely in a crowd-funded way because we did not think we could get traditional kind of funding for it. And we made it free on YouTube, so you can all watch it if you want and try and increase our viewer count. We don't make money from it. It's a no ads thing. I think it's the film I'm proudest to have made. I'm not saying it's the best, but from the idea of, making it from the script, from a writer we didn't know, to the way we funded it, we were the first to be fully crowdfunded, not only in Malaysia, but I think in Southeast Asia. And the way it was released simultaneously worldwide, and a lot of people could watch it at the same time. And the fact, surprisingly, that as like in the second half of the run, most of the viewers have come from Indonesia. Some of the comments by Indonesians make it obvious that they have never visited Malaysia, because they were asking quite basic questions like, why are Chinese people speaking Chinese in Malaysia? We in Indonesia, we don't have that. Everybody speaks Indonesian. So it's like subscribing to this idea that, if everybody just speaks the same language, then this sort of problem will go away, meaning racism and suspicion, that kind of thing, which is, of course, not the full story. We have seen ample evidence in many other countries where, speaking the language didn't really help. If people wanted to target you, they will still target you.
So to me, I think I was always very sensitive to race aspects, because I was about 6 years old during May 13th, 1969, which was the big race riots in Malaysia. And Malaysians tend not to talk about it. We feel uncomfortable. We don't want to offend. We don't want to cause, reignite racial tensions. So to me, it was quite amazing and impressive that your film, openly talked about race, but through this fiction. And I think maybe science fiction and maybe even horror stories allow creative people to tell stories in a way that may not be as in your face, if you like, as something that might be a social drama.
Yeah, because I think speculative fiction has a lot of potential. There's a lot of truth that can be told in fiction. As you know, it doesn't have to be something that is factually sort of like listed. But if it resonates with people, that means it's true, right?
So what would you hope, Amir Muhammed, for the future generations of Malaysians in terms of the creative world of books and film, but also in terms of how they will experience the city of KL and the Malaysian landscape?
I think people should walk more, because I think if you see things when you walk, it's very different from seeing things when you're in a car. And things will come from there. And to go to as many different cinemas countrywide in order to watch these movies. And they should listen more than they speak. I'm speaking for myself as well. We are so quick to want to offer our opinions and our takes on things, but why not just try listening to what is out there? My hope is that people will make interesting mistakes, because you're going to make mistakes anyway. So you might as well make them interesting, right?
I was talking to Amir Muhammed, publisher and filmmaker at Fixi Books and Kuman Pictures. The views expressed by my guests are entirely their own and do not necessarily reflect my views. For credits, photos, and links to some of the things we talked about, go to the show notes page on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. There are also more podcast episodes, written articles, and other bits and pieces on the main website at belongingacrosscultures.uk. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave a review or rating or follow Belonging Across Cultures. It really helps the algorithms bring the show to more listeners. Please also spread the word, tell your friends about the podcast, and share a bit of belonging with more people. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram as @TigerSpiritUK, and also on LinkedIn with my own name, Yang-May Ooi. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon.